Yesterday morning, I started off suggesting there was this fork in the road. There was a way that we could be thinking about PFM and service delivery, whereby we simply continue to use the same tools, but we use them better. And the assumption is that service delivery will improve as a result. That's one hypothesis, as Andrew put it. I think a second hypothesis is that actually, if we're thinking about service delivery and genuinely thinking about the needs of services, that there might actually need to be a more substantive rethink about the way we think about the role of public spending, the way we conceptualize public financial management. Now, I don't think we've resolved this fork over the past 2 days. I think what we have seen is actually just people do think about the world quite differently. And in some ways, these aren't necessarily new issues. There's always a kind of classic tension between finance ministries and spending ministries. But I do wonder whether we could still be doing better, all the same, in having more of a meeting of minds. And so I suppose what the challenge I want to put to my panelists here is really to think kind of pragmatically, where do we go from here? How can we help in this meeting of minds to address the service delivery problems that I think we all care about here? And so to do that, I have here an illustrious panel. Many of you've seen already over the past two days. We have Thomas Feiger here from the EU, Lorraine Hawkins from the Health Foundation, Chisholm Okechukwu from the Gates Foundation, Sheye Abimbola from Sydney University, and Marco Cangiano, who's a Senior Research Associate at ODI. And so I'm going to ask each of them to give their reflections on, how do we shift this forward, Thomas? So what do you take back to Brussels?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so I'm Thomas Feiger, European Commission. And just as a background, I'm in the budget support unit. As some of you may know, the European Commission is the world's largest budget support donor on grants. And in that context, public finance management is one important aspect because it is one of the eligibility criteria. I'm very grateful for the ODI to having organized this conference and to having invited me. I think it was very interesting for me, it was very useful to put PFM in the wider context and broaden the perspective a bit. I think what I take from the conference is. With regard to the three initial questions, I think what we have to keep in mind, PFM still is necessary and it's a basis, but it's a little bit like macroeconomic stability for implementation of national poverty reduction strategies. It is a necessary condition, but it does by no means ensure success. But if you don't have macroeconomic stability, then your policies will fail. And with PFM, it's a bit the same. If PFM systems are not in place or are if you are not functioning well, you will have trouble with service delivery, but good PFM systems at central level do not ensure service delivery down the road. So I think we have to keep this in mind. In this context, of course, for us, having a baseline of a PFM system is important and necessary. We are a strong supporter of the PFI framework as a diagnostic tool because it is the only tool that really gives you an overview over the entire PFM cycle. This being said, I think, and the conference has shown, is that we should not stop there. We may have a diagnostic, but we have to dig deeper, and we have to dig deeper into the causes and the consequences. And I think this is one important point where we need to think more in the future in terms of how we translate diagnostics into PFM reform plans, and how we design processes that are more inclusive and that bring together the different actors. The conference, for me, there were two very strong takes that came out each time that were two disconnects. One disconnect was between the ministries of finance and the sector ministries. And the second was between the central level and the local level. And this is, I think, these are the areas where we need to work on more. So not look at PFM only as a technocratic issue. There are certain technical things that need to be improved, but also look at it from the process angle. That means how can we encourage these two levels to interact more and to understand each other. And I think one thing is, of course, to agree on common objectives. Here we were talking about PFM objectives, preserving funds, and we were talking about service delivery objectives. But what is service delivery? But what are the objectives of both? I mean, service delivery is not an objective in itself either. We may deliver the wrong services. So somehow, in the conference, we did never mention the Sustainable Development Goals. So somehow we have to see what are the joint objectives of the two sides and agree on the national policies and how to implement it and what are the constraints. So that means more inclusive processes. And this has to be country specific, of course. And I think maybe this is also an area for further action research here. That also links up to the question of accountability in the terms of accountability for account-based accountability. So I think we also need this dialogue at the local level and not only at the central levels. With regard to diagnostic tools, we discussed spending reviews and other tools, and I think there were very interesting discussions on that, the PETs, spending reviews, and so on. And I think this is really something we should explore. But there is also an issue here of how to manage that, the proliferation of diagnostic tools. We have to prioritize them and we have to sequence them. That was one important conclusion also of a recent PFI review we did. And then finally, on the decentralized level, I want to say that important aspect to explore further and to look further into decentralization processes. And we had yesterday the presentation about the PFA module, the subnational level module, I think the voluntary module on service delivery. So I hope that all of you are going to look at that and provide inputs. I think that could be a possibility also to harness that and to look further into these issues.
Thank you. Marco, do you want to go up next?
Okay, let me jump in. I think, again, thanks for the eye for organizing all this. We always try to put together people in the room to discuss this issue. To some extent to overcome what I call a kind of a fragmentation silo within, we all keep using the expression PFN community. I still have to figure out what that is. So let me start by saying I'm a little bit concerned. This dichotomy, and it was clear in Jacqueline's chart. Where is Jacqueline? This PFM versus service delivered, I found it kind of artificial, if not plainly wrong. So public financial management is about managing public resources to deliver goods and service. If it doesn't do that, What else can it do? So going back to Andy's sort of initial point, I think we still fail on Article 1. So we still have, and I've heard from many of you, failure insistent to make sure the cash is available when payments are due. Now, until this is addressed, and this is part of what you call PFM architecture, pipelines, wiring, whatever you want to call it, the service delivery will suffer. Simple as that. Problem number two, and we tried basically, certainly personally, I tried for the last 10 years or so, to come up at least with a unified, not uniform, view of a PFM. Again, I use the word architecture for lack of a better word. Some of you may come up with a better word. So it's about role of government. So what is ultimate governance about? Again, as I said, it's providing goods or services that our collectivity needs for various purposes. Public goods, market failure, and so on and so forth. As Thomas just mentioned, the very fact that, then of course I've spent 25 years in an institution which is a little bit obsessed with macro stability and that sustainability. But again, that's a precondition, that's a necessary, certainly not sufficient. And again, it's a means to an end. To do what? To provide goods and services. So again, let's be clear on what we mean by this, because otherwise we risk reproduce the silo mentality within the profession, or certainly within this room, which exists in governments. What's the way most governments work? They have this silo which reflect the political system. Observation number two, and it's come out with in a lot of presentation, is a lot of failure at the service delivery level. It's a political game. So budget PFM, again, in the end, the overly simplified view perhaps is just the wiring, the plumbing. What goes in comes from political choices. A lot of what I've heard is failure of set priorities, is failure of planning. And I think collectively we may have a bit of a responsibility. A lot of countries, we kind of destroyed the planning function, and we thought to replace that with NTBF. That's simply false and has proved to be wrong. So these failures are reflected. The most glaring case, which has come up in virtually every panel, is decentralization. Decentralization in most countries, in my experience, follows a political agenda. So it was kind of interesting to see, hear from many people, including on this panel, how you push this down to the district level, only to realize it doesn't really work. A, because we haven't solved problem number one. B, because it just doesn't work. There is a dimension, there is a capacity constraint, there are IT issues, there are all sort of issues. So you kind of back up and you come back to something which is midway or gray area or whatever. In some cases, you go back all the way, you re-centralize certain things. So these are all kind of a dynamic process that is still pretty much playing. Reflecting all these, there are tensions, and this, I think this came up in the session discussing performance. We like the words kind of responsibility, accountability, but we also want sort of compliance, because there's a sort of a risk aversion circuit within governments. Now, responsibility is also about taking risk, exercising discretion, doing the right choice. But the compliance machinery that we as citizens want to be in place goes against that. So incentives are really kind of crashing one against the other. And we end up blaming auditors or accountants or those in charge of procurement because they prove to be kind of a force against delivering what ultimately we want to deliver. So I think we need a bit of a reflection on that and try to line up a little bit, because we're all asking these things. Particularly, and I'll leave it at that, we may come back at this, particularly from international institutions and the so-called donors community. I think we have pretty good share of responsibilities in feeding these tensions within governments.
Thank you, Marco. Susan?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think Marco just did a great job of sort of summarizing some of the things that, I highlighted from this conversation that we've had over the past 2 days. And I'd like to perhaps focus my response more about, like, how is the foundation grappling with this internally in terms of the way that it works and the kinds of programs that it supports. But before I go into that, I want to share with you guys an somewhat amusing conversation that I had with Mark prior to this panel session. So, recognizing that there is a dichotomy between the service delivery community and the PFM community, and however you sort of conceive of both, but it's come up that there's silos and dichotomies. And Mark said, for the final session, I think it would be great to bring people from the different sides of the table, so to say, to sort of reflect back on the conversation. And he said, Chisom, would you love to speak about PFM? And I said, that's interesting. I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I think that if you introduce me as, Chisom from BMGF, speaking about PFM, some people might find that a bit confusing or odd at the very least, because the foundation is in many ways associated with its work in the health sector, in financial service for the poor, agriculture, but I think maybe not so much in PFM, so to say. But I think that the foundation's evolution in this regard in many ways reflects the conversations that we've been having over the past few days. In the course, the foundation has huge ambitions, and in the course of our work, we are increasingly recognizing that there are sticky bottlenecks with regards to the rules and management of public finance that cannot be ignored. And so for the past, I'd say maybe 7 years or so, there's a team still growing that has been sort of wearing this PFM hat within the foundation, and in many ways trying to internally and I think also externally to serve as this bridge that Jacqueline had mentioned between both communities. And so I'd say that I'm not necessarily here speaking from a PFM perspective. I'm speaking from someone who sort of sits on both sides of the table. But yes, going back to the work that we do within the foundation, I perhaps make this quite concrete with the work that we're doing in countries. And one of the countries that I work on is Nigeria. Our program teams are often really troubled by issues around the flow of cash, which we talked about yesterday. One of the things that comes up often is that yes, resources are allocated, but that doesn't mean much. And I think we talked about it's not sufficient to have sufficient resources. Resources actually, financing has to be predictable, and it also has to be reliable. In Nigeria, I think this is a place where it's pretty obvious that those actually three conditions actually don't hold if you look at it in the health sector. When it comes to the predictability and the reliability of financing, there are myriad of reasons, but one that is perhaps most glaring is the fact that the budget in and of itself is just it's not credible. And so that's something that we've been trying to, work with the Ministry of Finance to address. And I think that, we've taken various approaches that recognize that there are incentive issues, that there is a complex political economy that determines and defines why the budget itself is not credible. And we've worked with partners who are here. Neil Cabri, for example, has been working with the Budget Office around these issues, using approaches that are adaptive, so to say. And I think that of course, it's still very much early to say, but there's some promising developments, so to say. And so for us, these are some of the ways that we're sort of grappling with these issues within the foundation, but also at the country level. However, beyond that, we do recognize that, again, because, in comparison to, I think when Marco was talking about donors, we're probably in the PFM space, we're not as huge as other players, like perhaps the IMF, right? And so for us, we recognize that it's important to continue to have these kinds of conversations to bridge at a more international level these silos. And so we very much welcome the conversation that we're having here with ODI. The only thing I would say before I wrap up is that I do hope that when we do all gather here again for a 2.0 version of this conversation, we would go very quickly to practical, real solutions to these problems and how we can actually get to that. So thanks.
Thank you. Lorraine, do you have the practical, real solutions for us? 5 minutes.
5 minutes. I mean, Mark, when we spoke about this before, I think you also wanted me to tap my
Please.
considerable age in this, working at this sort of interface of PFM and health. And I suppose, in doing that, I suppose I'd like to start with a comment from Kuram, which really resonated, which is that the plumbing side of PFM systems should just work. And the people in both finance ministries and health ministries who are working on the more policy aspects of resource allocation and public sector performance shouldn't really need to know much about it. Their interfaces with that system are minimal. When I worked in the New Zealand Treasury in the decades too long ago to mention without embarrassment, the system worked. I didn't know how the plumbing worked, but it did work. Bills were paid on time, there weren't budget execution bottlenecks, the budget was credible, the accounts could be trusted, and when we sort of upgraded and modernised those systems, and I was a program manager in the Ministry of Health, my very nice management accountant would come to me and say, Lorraine, in the monthly reports and quarterly reports that I give to you and your division, how can I present the data better? What kind of questions do you want to ask of the data, and can we assist with the analysis? I loved that man. I think that, so if things work well, all of you, the PFM types that are on the plumber side of the business, who are mostly accountants or FMIS experts, I'm immensely grateful for what you do, because it's wonderful not to have to think about that and not to have to interact with you. And I mean that in the nicest possible way, at least in a professional context. How has all of the effort that's gone into getting the plumbing right worked, and over the years that I've been working in developing countries? On my optimistic days, and I'm now working mostly in Europe and Central Asia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, in that region, pretty much in all countries, the plumbing works. And there's even in some of the low middle income and low income ones, the plumbing more or less works. And budget credibility is pretty good when they go through periods of economic and political stability with no wars or natural disasters. And so in those countries, even though there's capacity constraints and resource limits, with very good technical assistance, and it's taken, more than 20 or 30 years, the plumbing more or less works. And if you're working in the health sector, you don't have to worry too much about that side of things. But one of the things I've noticed about how health finance people working in that region are now working, and this goes for the health agencies like WHO, not just the more financially oriented agencies like the World Bank, the health people and the PFM and Ministry of Finance community, I think, have more constructive relationships and engagement in that region than in any other that I work in or have worked in. And it's partly because the plumbing issues are more or less out of the way. And as a result of that, a lot of the things that health people and PFM people used to disagree about, we can now agree about. Health people can urge governments to use make sure their health insurance funds are on budget, and that their payments are executed through the Treasury system, and that they're not outside the system or with parallel systems. And donors have been willing to use country systems to a greater extent in some of those countries where their own policies will allow it. So all of that's a relatively optimistic story. It's not a perfect story, because you still see, I think, when it comes to the sort of resource allocation set of issues, there is tension. And there's always going to be a natural and healthy tension between finance people dealing with the budget constraint and the advocates for efficiency, if you like, in the system, and health ministries. But I'm not seeing the health agencies in countries or the health international agencies seriously engaging with the efficiency agenda. And in many countries, the level of capacity and understanding of the finance ministry of health reform, health financing, health policy issues, and the required institutions is not there. there are good country examples where it is there, and in those countries you do see a productive and appropriate dialogue. But I mean, on the whole, it's a pretty optimistic scenario. With a small number of country exceptions. In those country exceptions, what's gone wrong? To some extent, I think there's some countries that look unlucky, because it does take incredibly good practical TA with a degree of continuity in a country to sort those basic issues. And in some of those countries have just been unlucky with the TA and the resources that they've had. Others, but I mean, I think a bigger factor is in a number of those countries, the reasons why even the basics are not solved are primarily political and to do with the operation of kind of major stakeholder interests in the country. And there's a set of people that do not want perfectly fixable problems to be fixed. And I suppose one of the things that that was touched on actually in our first session by Ratan Roy, that was something we didn't really come back to, and I think in many countries, some of the lagging countries in that region and many countries in other regions, the fact that perfectly fixable practical problems on the plumbing side are not being fixed isn't just because we don't know how, it's because we don't know how to tackle the people who don't want to do it. And I think we do need more. I think we do need to do more thinking, work, and research on how to work in those environments. And I think we obviously, I think there's most people in this room are perfectly well aware of it. We can't just stick to a good practice. One good practice model is what we pursue everywhere. In some places, we're going to have to come up with more creative ways of addressing some of those political economy bottlenecks. So I think we started this session with that emphasis on politics, and I think we need to keep that in view as we finish it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lorraine. Shayu.
So I've been asked to be the academic on the panel, and what I thought I'd do is put on my hat as a journal editor. And in that role, I often advocate to academics, usually in health, about the kinds of studies and research and evidence that I want to see in the journal and I want to see in the literature. And I'm going to try and do the same thing with you, whilst not pretending at all that I'm across all your literature. So I'm judging what is perhaps in the literature in your field by the conversations that we've had yesterday and today. And as I began in the morning today, I think that there is a lot of value if PFM is going to influence service delivery. There's a lot of value in taking complexity seriously. I'm beginning from that premise, and to, I think, not necessarily be too bogged down about trying to answer the question as to whether an intervention works or not. Right? Most PFM interventions would work somewhere, at some point, somehow. And I think the real question is to understand where those places are, what circumstances make it work in those kinds of places, what stops it from working, and how does it perform in the long term. I think that there is a lot of value in taking those kinds of questions very seriously in the literature. There is, and to do that, it will be important to take both quantitative data seriously, but also qualitative data seriously. My sense is that there's a lot of tacit, buried knowledge in people's heads that come out when they are poked, or when they feel they need to say something. Again, judging from the conversations yesterday and today. And I feel that those kinds of knowledge need to be documented one way or another. People have a lot of experience in different countries. There's a lot of case study that could be synthesized with experiences, and I think that there's a lot of value in taking that seriously. Again, I'm not sure if I'm speaking to researchers or not, but if I'm not speaking to researchers, I'm speaking to people who give money to researchers to do research, and you could do that. I also think that there is a lot that could be done around understanding how learning happens within countries. There is I get a sense that countries are still seen as a black box. And there's a lot of agency within countries, there's a lot of things that happen within countries, and there's a lot of learning that happens between segments of a country and across time. And it would be good to also find a way to document that and to turn that into a research question, if possible. Because that's how you fix those kinds of small, persistent problems. It's getting how a system works from the inside. And also, my last point is, again, going to the donor question, and the dominant narrative in the room yesterday and today comes from a donor perspective. And again, I don't think, not in health, but certainly not in PFM as well, I don't think that relationship is sufficiently problematized. I struggle with pronouncing that word. There is a lot to learn and to understand about how that process works. You go into a country, you do stuff. How does that work? Right? This is something I say to other people as well. Right? We don't ask that question enough. I don't think we ask it at all. Right? To say, how does that process work? How do you get a country to own something? How do you get a country to run with something? There was this nice example of the pets, the survey, which wasn't as useful as it was objectively. It wasn't used by the country. It's a good question to actually, turn that into a thing to study. And I wish that there's a lot more self-reflection that allows that kind of question to be asked and answered, and that allows people in this community to feed their experiences and their failures and successes into answering those kind of questions.
Thank you, all the panelists. What we're going to do now, we have about, I'm going to take about one round of comments, one last round of comments. Anyone that wants to come back to any of the panelists, throw a grenade at any of the panelists. Anything that you feel that you would have liked to have said over the last 2 days that there's burning inside that you feel someone should have said. Any last challenges? And then I will give the sort of panelists 1 minute at the end. So we've probably got about 10, 15 minutes for comments. Andrew and then the lady next to him.
Good afternoon again. Firstly, thank you for allowing me to speak so much. I've had more than my share of interventions, so I hope you all excuse me. Firstly, I very much enjoyed the comments of the panel, and I think there is a sort of consensus emerging to some extent. But I'd like to pitch it in the sense of an answer to the question Mark posed at the beginning of our session yesterday. If we are at a fork in the road, is it the case that we continue with the sorts of PFM tools that we have been working on, but we just do it better? Or is it the case that we need a new paradigm? My answer to that is that we need a new kind of institutional paradigm. So it's not necessarily that the technical tools of public finance management, medium-term planning, program-based budgeting, performance budgeting, devolution of financial responsibility, those are all very useful tools, and I'm not sure that there's any need to change them or to dump them. Although I did say some nasty things about program budgeting, in the right way, it can be a useful tool. So my sense is that the tools are good, but we need a new institutional paradigm in I think, 3 senses. Firstly, that I think the old idea that ministries of finance and sector ministries should compete and be rivals should just be dumped once and for all. In the UK, Her Majesty's Treasury has always had the tradition that if a sector minister wants to speak to somebody in HMT, then she or he can only speak to somebody more junior. So if you're the Minister of Education, you will hardly ever speak to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You speak to a junior minister. If you're a director in the Ministry of Health and you want to speak to someone, you'll be met by an assistant director. And it would be done systematically. I'm not sure if HMT still does it, in order to reassert, this rivalry and this hierarchy. So one thing I think which has come across from all our discussions is that that's no way of working. Collaboration and working together and giving permanent visas to people like Seya to be part of the PFM world is definitely the way forward. And I think most of us in the room probably agree on that. It would be very nice, I think, to sort of concretize that as one step. The other, I think, is that PFM ought to be more analytical. I agree with what Lorraine is saying. For too long, we've focused on plumbing. And yes, sometimes plumbing doesn't always work, as Marco was pointing out. But increasingly, we ought to be solving the big policy questions. And we ought to be using, in particular, big data and the technical tools that we now have to have more sophisticated types of analysis than we used to. And it's high time that we use those techniques better, and that should be much more at the center of what PFM and PFM thinking does. And then finally, to pick up, I think, on a phrase that a common friend of many of ours often uses, Matt Andrews at the Kennedy School of Government, we ought to be much more problem-driven. PFM should be solving the bottleneck problems that Chisholm and I think and others were addressing. And it shouldn't be sort of a sui generis thing that creates its own solutions for its own problems. We need to respond to the problems generated by service delivery and make sure that PFM is there. So I think a different institutional paradigm, but not necessarily new tools.
Beatrice again from the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, Nairobi. And just taking us back again to the bridge. And I see a human factor on that bridge. So what is it we are going to do to add value in this human being in terms of character, in terms of the right attitudes, the right values? And therein, as an educationist, again, I see the unity of the sciences. The STEM, the social sciences, the arts and humanities. So let us, focus on building holistic competencies in our graduates, in the workers, the ethics that we need. And therefore, this will be a solution, I think, in terms of bridging the gap and unifying the public finance management systems and the service delivery. Thank you.
Peter Boulding, an independent consultant. I'd just like to put in a plea for some of the resources that haven't been addressed and used and mentioned in the past sessions, and they might have helped a bit. The Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, CIPFA, of which I'm a member, has got a whole system approach to PFM, which I think those that haven't looked at it on their website, it's freely available, can do so, and it covers the entire system and well worth looking at. On the accounting and audit side of things, I certainly think that management accounts have been mentioned once, thank you. And management accounts should be available to any management and to be coordinated and compiled in a way that would help you to make decisions. And public financial management, as far as we're concerned in CIPFA, is to provide management information for better decision making, which should enable better problem solving and better delivery of service. So management accounts are important to all of that, as are annual audits for external users and annual accounts in the same way. Internal audit as well needs to be addressed and hasn't been mentioned at all, but internal audit is a management tool that you can all use in any entity and organisation, and if you haven't got one, organise it so that you do, and therefore that will help address many of the issues, the bottlenecks that occur, particularly value for money issues. So I think there's lots of stuff that's already been done, already well established. In New Zealand is a luminous example of PFM, but Australia too, and Canada, US, UK, and Scandinavian countries.
Thank you. David Hoole from Oxford Policy Management. It's been interesting listening to the discussion and the frequent use of the plumbing analogy, which I use with my own team and my own children to try and explain what public finance is. And if you think of a plumber, when a plumber comes into your house, they come to you and they say, what's the problem? They don't come to you and say, you need a new boiler and you need to sort out that door and you need a new thermostat because that's what they look like these days. They don't do that. So somebody asked for practical, real solutions, and this discussion, this seminar has been very helpful in crystallizing for me the way in which some of the large-scale programs that we work on in public finance are changing. And I've started to observe this in Pakistan, where we do quite a lot of work. We've just completed a large program for DFID at subnational level. It's a PFM program. The clients are the departments of finance and planning and the central agencies of finance, the accountant general, the auditor general, and so on. But the objectives of the program were to demonstrate improved access to and satisfaction with basic services at provincial level. We're just about to start a program for the EU in the same country, different provinces. The objectives of that PFM program, which is centered on the Department of Finances and Planning in Sindh and Baluchistan, the objectives are to move the SDGs. I don't know how we're going to do that. But what we are going to do is we're going to walk in to the Department of Finance and the Department of Health and the Department of Education and say, what's the problem? So maybe that's the sort of practical, real solution that certainly I'm taking away as a different way of approaching PFM reform, rather than, as we have done in the past, saying, well, actually all the PFA indicators are going to move from D to B over the next 5 years, job done. That's my takeaway. Thank you.
It's Zahir Ali from Equirus. My question actually, my comment actually builds on what David just said. And I come from a development practitioner background. And when I came to this conference, working on multiple PFM programs around the world, is that I wanted to get a view that is the solution in building the capacity of the Central Ministry of Finance and to get them more aware about health and education and water and all of these issues? Or is it that I work with the Ministry of Health and Education and build their capacity in how to do a budget? The view I would have from increasing autonomy and program-based budgeting is that there's a greater need to work with the ministries of health to make sure that they understand the budgeting process and that there is a greater understanding of the plumbing that's there.
Just to say, I think I can very much agree with what Andrew said about the need for a different institutional paradigm and sort of link that to the problem-driven. What I'd like to do is a kind of a plea, because in many ways, I think in PFI or in whatever it was called before, I know that there are examples of processes that were collaborative processes between ministries of finance and other ministries or line ministries. And I mean, what Andrew and Tagai were telling us is an example of that. But there are other examples, and that's not a BSI or ODI or PFI example, but there are also examples that are in-house. And I think if we could harness do a kind of sociological analysis, like Saya was talking about, okay, how did they work? What worked, what didn't work in that? Where did it work? Why did it work? And how far did it move the paradigm? And then sort of try to draw some lessons from that. That's all.
So my name is David Nabena with the Nigeria Governors Forum. I want to piggyback on what Shay said, which I think is very, very important. And it also relates with your question on status quo versus a new paradigm. So the same question. So you have a PFM reform. It works in one jurisdiction and it doesn't work in another. And the question is it a sufficient condition for better service delivery? So if it's not, so what should we be asking? Should we ask some social questions, political questions? So should we still focus on the PFM toolkit, or we should expand the box and ask some new questions? I think it's important for us to, look beyond just PFM because it's not enough. So what kind of conversations can we have? What are questions can we put into the solutions that we put forward that can make better service delivery work?
I think, first of all, I would like to say that I don't come from the PFM world traditionally, but I'm going to stop saying that after this because we're not looking at a dichotomy, but really how we can link. And when I was invited here, I was very excited to see the link between service delivery and financial management. And I must say, in the early sessions, it still seemed like there were very strong silos, and we had PFM and a lot of this plumbing terminology. But I'm glad to hear that the plumbing somehow is fixed. Of course, it may not be completely fixed, but it's not the issue. I think that's really good news. And going back to what several people have said, how can we then move forward? Is it looking at the service delivery perspective and ask, what is the problem? So if we can come from service delivery and then support it with the plumber, instead of the plumber coming and saying, okay, we have these tools that we can use for you to solve your service delivery problems. I think that we need to dare to come from the service delivery point of view, which will be different in different countries and different contexts, because we have heard and we all know that there are different political values, there are different systems, and therefore if we dare to come from that perspective and see how PFM can work in that context, and not assume that the plumber has the solutions to everyone, but come from what is the problem. I think that finally hearing that today is for me a big step forward.
Ivor, Leslie, Marcel, and then I think that will be us.
Thank you very much. Edward Hedger occasionally organise one or two of these conferences as well, so congratulations to the team. An analogy would just sort of occur to me as I was thinking about this. I don't know whether anyone caught the BBC Wreath lectures this year, where the retiring Supreme Court Judge Jonathan Sumption talked about this notion of law's expanding empire, and he was talking about the idea that where issues that have become policy issues that have become politically difficult to resolve have been pushed over to the legal system for the courts to adjudicate, because that tends to sort of create some sort of almost objective criteria on what are actually essentially political questions. And it caused me to sort of wonder whether there's a narrative here about the question about PFM's expanding empire and how one might think about that. Because I'm left probably a little bit conflicted on this question of this sort of relationship about PFM and service delivery, and whether it's the right answer is to remove the silo and permit just an expansion into the territory, partly because that deals with the silo problem by definition, and partly because it might be that there are all these great tools that could be applied. On the other hand, there is the risk that suddenly, I think the question that might have been asked or has been asked before, well, what isn't PFM then? And I wonder whether as a sort of resolution or reconciliation of the practical senses, and maybe it's another riff on the sort of the problem-driven thing, but a mental check, if anyone's talking about PFM reform for the sake of PFM reform, stop. If there isn't something that's consequent, it picks up Marco's point about for goods and services, but we all know when we're doing it, suddenly we've tipped into make this system look shinier because we like the shininess of it. So just it's a sort of a simple corrective device I think we don't deploy often enough. And I mean, linking to that is there's always some sort of policy purpose to it. The other side, just I suppose, be careful that we, by removing the boundary, we don't. I mean, it's probably rather nice as a map of the world there, but I mean, if that's PFM's expanding empire, have we got too far as well? So I'm just left with I mean, I don't know. It's probably. I wish it was a more practical point, but I'm left a little bit conflicted on that tension.
Just a very quick word to say thank you to all the organisers. I think, as usual, this has been a very stimulating event and a great opportunity to catch up with old friends and make some new friends. So congratulations on the kind of dynamics of the thing and the content. I just wanted to make a point, a theme that I think has come up repeatedly in different discussions, and maybe we don't pay, I don't personally think we don't pay enough attention to it, is actual capability. Because we're introducing new tools and techniques, and we talk about processes, but we don't think very much about the people who are actually responsible, about the plumber and how well he's trained, whether he can deal with all these newfangled tools that are presented to him. So I would suggest that we actually, as a PFM community, need to pay more attention to the human resource management aspects of PFM.
Hello, Leslie Cole from Budget Strengthening Initiative in Liberia. And I guess my comment is coming from a slightly different direction, where I think for me, something that would be interesting to look at coming out of this is, in a lot of contexts, development partners have a massive role in service delivery, and I think it'd be really interesting to think about what are some of the lessons for them in their design, because ultimately they want sustainability, they want handover, but in the course of all of these various conversations we've had, for example, in the hospital, where you have the parallel funding structures, how do they interact with each other? I've seen the World Bank develop multiple PFM systems that are actually not mutually reinforcing but mutually destructive. You see atrophying of systems because they want short-term results, but then when they leave, all of those kinds of things, which in certain contexts I think is potential for an impact, to try and have them think about the design and the relationship between all of the issues that have been identified here.
Thank you. Actually, mine was triggered with my sister once again, and I'm happy that now she will be not saying that she doesn't come from the PFM background, but now she has got everything as far as the PFM is concerned. Why I'm saying that one? Actually, when we were designing our PFM running, our strategy, I kept advocating that the PFM should be the foundation for any and every sector, because whatever you are doing is going to require the PFM context. Why I'm saying this one? In any sector that we've been talking here, being the health, being the education, you need to plan properly, because at the end, whatever you are doing, you need to plan. You need to have plans. So once you've planned, you need to ensure that whatever plans you have, you can cost them. It doesn't mean that you need to be a PFM person so that you understand that one. So once you have your plans, once you've costed them, then you can communicate them easily to the PFM practitioners. Then finally, not finally, but you need to understand the mechanism, not mechanism as such, but you need to ensure light spending. I've been struggling back home when I'm dealing with doctors or researchers. They say, we need the money. We got these grants. We need to spend it. But I say, no, you spend it, but there is principles. You can spend, but there is principles. If you got this grant for ABCD, and the grant hit the treasury bank account, we need to ensure that the laws and responsibility, the principles are fulfilled. So then finally you need to accept, or any person in any sector need to accept that you need to be accountable. Because at the end, the accountability should be enforced, whatever the sector, being education, health, agriculture, the accountability should be enforced. Finally, the last one, the light tools, because I've seen a non-PFM having a light system. Jesse, she told about that system is a good system. So having system that can support whatever we're doing will help us to remain accountable, will help us to be transparent. So I may say that PFM at the end can't be divorced with other sectors, but they should work hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's go back in the order that, well, we'll do reverse order actually this time. Shay, why don't you start? And then
You're not ready.
No. One of my take-home realizations is that I think Nigeria is about to be dethroned from its reputation of being people who talk too much. And I think we are losing that to Rwandans. I think we are losing that status very quickly to Rwandans. That said. Thank you. It's been great hanging out with you guys. Thank you very much.
Marco, why don't you go?
Okay, lots of stuff. Now, Andy left the room. Do we need a new paradigm? No. We have enough tools. We have to work harder, try to break these artificial barriers. I cannot think what the new paradigm might look like, so I insist on that. Just for the spirit of disclosure, I've been working with Matt Andrews for the last 7 years, so I certainly belong on the school that has to be problem-driven, has to be adaptive. And human capital actually is key in all this. I may have given the impression in my analogy with architecture, the PFM, there are commonalities, but if I look at PFM system around the globe, even what we think of the good ones, they all look different. They have a lot of common elements, but Sweden looks definitely different from Australia, and Australia looks different from South Africa and from Chile and so on and so forth. So there's ample room within what we have to break this barrier. And again, the human factor is key at the end of the day. There is a lot of things we can use the technology better, of course. Often the technology drives the processes, should really be the other way around. The strategy and the priority should come first. But what we're still missing, and is reflected a little bit in this room, there's no, that goes back to those of you who are actually in academia, there's no PFM cadre or whatever you want to call it. I teach often in public policy schools. They don't understand the macro. They don't understand accounting. They're not auditors. And the auditors don't understand. So we have to create people that actually can understand what government is. Because government is policy, politics, and complexities. We cannot hope to address this with a single tool. Last plea, diagnostics. I think we have way too many. They can always be improved. What I found a little bit of an aberration that are be used as a mandatory point of view to fill this kind of fiduciary role, but that haven't been designed to do that, number one. And they only work if they are genuinely requested and asked by country. If we keep imposing this on country every 3 years, what we developed, and we have developed already, is a compliance-oriented mentality, is a study to the tax reaction, instead of actually going and dig deeper to understand what the problems might look like. So that's where we're really sort of, again, as a donors community, I think we really need kind of to reflect on this, because I don't think we've been terribly helpful for the last decade or so.
I'm trying to surprise all of you. Just keep you on your toes. You don't know who's coming next. Okay, Lorraine. Yeah, please, because you've got a train to catch. So
Sorry. Now I want to pick up on several points. First of all,
in 1 minute though.
Yeah, I don't share the impression that the plumbing is fixed. This may be the case for certain countries, but certainly not for the regions I follow, which is Africa. We see a progress in certain areas, but also stagnation and regress in some areas, and very often this is the case for the basic things that are missing. So that my answer to the question from over there, it is not a question of building capacities in finance ministries versus sector ministries. These have to be parallel processes, and we have to accept and see that public finance management reform is a long-term process that has to continue, that has to go on. I can certainly agree on that we need more analytical tools. I wouldn't see this as a new institutional paradigm, but it's certainly an important aspect that we need to be more analytical, and also that we need to tackle more the political economy constraints. Because when we are talking about the problem-driven approach, I couldn't agree more. But the reason why approaches to PFM reform are not in many cases not problem-driven is because there is a lack of political leadership at the highest level, or at least at the ministerial level, if not beyond the Ministry of Finance. And then we get an accumulation of actions and needs into huge programs that are not prioritized, not focused, and not followed up, and that reap very, very little results.
Thank you. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe, Chisholm.
I'll be very quick. So I just wanted to build on what Andrew said before he left. I think I'm inclined to agree with what he said about, a paradigm, a new institutional paradigm, because it helps to solve, in my sense, I'm not 100% sure that by just working better the way we've been working, we'll get to it, because if that's the case, why haven't we? Because we've been trying to do that, right? And I also...
a list of why.
Sorry?
I can give a long list of why.
Okay. But on the other hand, I'm quite uncomfortable with this notion that there needs to be this huge fundamental change. So I think that that's like a good midway. Having said that, though, I do want to say something that I've heard quite a bit in this conference, but I also hear generally in these kinds of conversations, goes back to this tension between the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Health at the country level, to say that I'm not sure that I agree that there is, particularly within the Ministry of Finance, a lack of interest in service delivery or outcomes. I do think that there is a lot of interest. I used to work in the Ministry of Finance, and these were issues that did come up. I now work with ministries of finance, even though I'm not in the Ministry of Finance, and very often, you hear the DG of Budget asking you, well, if I pay more if I give the health sector more money for RI, how do I know that coverage rates will actually increase? They really care about these issues. I do think, though, that what is different and what needs to change is this issue of incentives. Mm-hmm. In as much as they care, if at the end of the day they are judged by broader issues around fiscal discipline, aggregates, that will always be their reflective response. So it's more about changing the incentives to match their interests. So just to say that I do think that some of these shifts are already happening, essentially. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Lorraine.
I hope you're going to do the last word.
I will do the last one.
Right, so my second to last word is, I think that on the issue of I think Leslie's point about the lessons for development partners, I think there's a need for the health sector reform, particularly the health sector financing reform fraternity, just as much as the PFM fraternity, to look at lessons for reform design and for reform sequencing. I think if a paradigm shift is needed anywhere towards a more problem-driven and therefore incremental and prioritised approach, it probably starts with the development community, and particularly with the development community that work on complex system type issues. And in that category, we've got the health system reformers, probably some education system reformers, and the PFM fraternity. I think we just, where we've done harm, it's because we have gone for overreach in the complexity and radicalness of of the reforms we're promulgating, and we haven't stepped forward building the kind of sequencing reforms to build the capacities that we need for reform as we go. But I would say that while we do all of this kind of self-scrutiny and mea culpa activity, which we should all do and is very salutary, we should first do no harm. In many countries that I'm working in now, there is a declining role for traditional development partners and an expanding role for non-traditional partners. The non-traditional partners aren't engaged with either of these system agendas, in my experience. And I think that that some of the issues around kind of risks and adverse effects that we're all beating ourselves up about probably haven't been experienced and worked through by some of those newer non-traditional partners. And I think we do face a challenge of how to, in both the health systems fraternity and the PFM fraternity, how do we seek constructive ways of engagement and common ground with some of those new partners?
Thank you. So I will give my 3 lessons, the 3 things that I learnt, or 3 reflections that I had. I agree with what Chisholm said, actually, that there is a common interest in seeing services improved. But one thing I've heard actually quite clearly is there is actually quite different theories within the room about how to get there. Some people are of the view that a finance ministry can drive improvements to service delivery through strengthening compliance mechanisms. But we've heard alternative theories about actually relaxing rules in some cases. Now, they may be able to reconcile in one theory, but people are actually thinking about these things quite differently. So that's one thing. I think that the second thing, I've just heard now a lot of people saying we need to be more problem-driven. And I suppose, I would agree with that. A concern I have about PFM people sometimes when they say that is the assumption is that the problem is in my toolkit. And it's around the budget cycle and it's related to the PFM system. And I think actually this morning we heard that not all public spending problems are necessarily through the national budget. We heard about decentralisation, we heard about services that are, the government may play more of a regulatory role. So we need to be careful about sort of preaching problem-driven, but actually already thinking that we've got the toolkit to fix it. And I think the third thing, and I took a lot actually from Shaye's comments around the role of knowledge. I think as a kind of research strategy, I think there has been a lot of, PFM is something that rightly people think is important, the core administrative capacities of government. We also think service delivery is important. And so we're going to do a research to try and find some kind of linear relationship between those 2 things. And actually, I think we could learn a lot more by just figuring out what is happening in certain places, why that's happening. This case study evidence, I think, would be enormously important for enhancing our knowledge. So that hopefully, when we do 2.0, we have some more pragmatic solutions. Thank you.